So everything should be live after this.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Shaughnessy. I serve as the chair of the Professional and Counselor Advisory Committee for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that the members of the advisory committee respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin.
Here.
Good morning. Harriet.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm here.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
Melissa Briggs. Not here yet. Michael Countryman, we said he will not be here. Michelle Fairbank.
I don't see her on the Zoom yet.
Okay, thank you. Acha Goras.
Yeah,
Good morning.
thank you.
Bob Kircher.
I'm here.
Good morning. Good morning. Vanessa Perez.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Andrew Secor.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. Adil Torres Rivera.
Here.
Good morning. I note the following BSRB staff are also present. David Fye,
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Good morning, David and Leslie. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Laura. And Melissa Briggs is on the Zoom call now, so she is also in attendance.
Great. Good morning, Melissa.
Good morning.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide time for public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting today as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of COMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. May 22nd, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice of at that meeting on the board's website. An agenda and other media materials have been posted on the website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with a subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I checked it before the meeting. There's no one currently on the conference call line.
Terrific. Thank you, David. The meeting is now called to order and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda, which is, of course, agenda approval. So I need a motion and a second to approve this agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, thank you, Jim and Vanessa. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Okay, the agenda passes. Thank you. Next, we will do a review of the minutes from the meeting of April 17th, 2023, which you received in the packet that David Fye sent out at the end of last week. Anybody have any questions, comments, or changes to those minutes? I don't hear anything, so I will need a motion to approve the minutes and a second, please.
I move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you so much. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, the minutes are approved from April 17th, 2023, and we will move on to the executive director's report. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Leslie. So I'm going to provide a few updates on operations here at the BSRB, some legislative updates, and then some information from the most recent board meeting on May 8th. So first, some operating updates. There was a bill involving the BSRB that passed this past legislative session just a few weeks ago that was sub for Senate Bill 131. And I'll go into a little bit more information about that bill as we go through this report a little bit later. But as part of that bill, we received authority to hire 2 new staff members as licensing specialists. So we are working on those logistics. We cannot hire someone until after the fiscal year starts, which begins on July 1st, but we are making preparations before that time, and we hope to hire individuals shortly after the beginning of the next fiscal year, which will help with our licensing processes. Additionally, we are in a process of transitioning about half of our staff members over to new laptops. The state offers a desktop as a service type arrangement of leasing laptops and other devices. And so our staff members have been transferring onto those new devices over the last 3 years. So, my first year, we started a couple of us over to that, and then we added a few more last year, and this will complete sort of a phase-in approach. And then as we have new members come along, we will have them on that rotation as well to make sure that we have good technology that is current, and then that will be helpful for our operations too. Additionally, we do have 2 new pieces of equipment in the board conference room. We've been using those to do some hybrid meetings. We received some grant funding. We applied for 2 different grants through some federal COVID-19 Spark funding that was made available for modernization of technology. And so we submitted 2 grant proposals, one to replace our existing projector in the board conference room, and the second was to purchase an OWL camera to allow for better hybrid meetings as we do things a little bit differently after the pandemic has gotten better. And so we have both of those. They were approved. We received the technology and we received the funding. So those expenditures have been made. As part of that responsibility, we have to provide monthly updates until that's all been completely finished. But I think all of those steps will be finished by the end of this month. So if you are ever in the office, feel free to take a look at some of those. I think really happy to have that new technology. Secondly, in terms of some legislative updates, I wanted to give you an update first on the BSRB budget. So as a reminder, the BSRB is a fee-funded agency, so we do not receive any money from the state general fund. We operate primarily by the fees that we receive, especially license fees for the 7 professions that we oversee. However, the legislature does have a role concerning our budget. Every year we submit a revised budget estimate, and the legislature approves not only the current amount that we will be spending, they also set a limit for 1 or 2 budget years in the future. So that way, the next year we come back to the legislature and we have adjustments to our already approved budget. And so this year we went before the House and the Senate separately. They each have their own separate appropriations bill at the start. And in the Senate committee, the governor had recommended a certain amount for fiscal year 23 that we are currently in, and then fiscal year 24 and 25. And for the Senate, they recommended the same amounts that the governor had recommended with no changes. In the House, they recommended the same amounts the governor had recommended, but they made a recommendation to add some language in the budget bill for the BSRB budget. And this language is called a proviso. And proviso language either directs the agency specifically to do something or it prohibits them from spending money to do a certain purpose. And the BSRB had requested a bill this legislative session, and I'll go into a few more items on that bill. But one of the items the board had originally requested in that bill was a change to the continuing education requirements for the professions. For certain levels of licensure that are able to diagnose and treat, they have to receive 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment every 2-year license cycle. And so in looking around at what other states require, that requirement was a little unusual compared to what other states require, but there are some other requirements that some states do require in terms of specific categories for getting your continuing education hours. And so in that bill, the board had recommended decreasing the number of continuing education hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours each 2-year period, and to add a new 3-hour requirement in continuing education in the area of cultural diversity. So you may be asking what this has to do with the budget conversation. Well, when we go in front of the budget committees, they can ask questions on anything, and they ask questions about the language in that bill, which was being heard by a separate committee. Basically, they expressed concerns about the new requirement of continuing education and cultural diversity. So the language that the budget committee added as the proviso would prohibit the BSRB from requiring as a condition of licensure or renewal of licensure any training or education in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, and some other related topics that the language applied to. And so the budget committee voted to include that as an attachment for the agency's budget in fiscal year 24 and 25. The House Appropriations Committee considered that and decided to keep it on the bill, and that stayed in the House version of their budget bill. And then when the House passed their budget bill and the Senate passed their different budget bill, they came together to resolve items of difference. And that item they discussed, and the ultimate consensus opinion by the legislature was to keep that item on the agency's budget. And so the ultimate budget bill that was passed during the main part of the session included that language. So that bill that was passed as part of the budget. However, the governor has the opportunity to review bills, and specifically for appropriations bills, the governor can do line item vetoes. And so the governor did a handful of line item vetoes to the budget bill, and one of the items that she vetoed was the proviso language for the BSRB. When the legislature came back for the final days of the session, it's usually called the omnibus period, they considered any additional actions, such as doing another appropriations bill or passing any bills before they ended their session. And one item that they can do is they can also look at vetoes to consider overriding vetoes. And so the legislature did consider overriding several vetoes. The first one they considered was the item on the BSRB budget. And by one vote, the veto override failed. And so basically, to make a long story short, the governor's veto stands. And so that proviso language that was originally added and was discussed a lot of this session, that has been removed from the agency's budget. So it does not apply. Now, in terms of what that means, the BSRB does not currently require continuing education or other requirements in those areas. But with it being removed, it kind of resolves any kind of other questions about what this language could apply to. And I'll talk a little bit more about the bill, but I know there were some questions during this session about that proviso language, and it was a little confusing because of all of the different movements and the different bodies that considered it. So I just wanted to pause here for a second before I go forward and see if you had any questions on that proviso language or anything related to the budget. Okay, well, if not, I'll go on to the next item. I mentioned the BSRB had requested a bill. This year, we requested the same language in the House and the Senate, which would allow both chambers to consider the bill simultaneously. The approach the House took was to go ahead and schedule a hearing for the bill, and that was originally House Bill 2340. In the Senate side, it was, I believe, Senate Bill 176, but the approach the Senate took was they decided that they would wait for the House to take action on the bill first, and then when it moved over to the Senate, then they would consider the version that the House had already, if it passed the House chamber, then they would consider that version of it instead of working on the same language simultaneously. So it went to the House committee. It was heard by the House Health and Human Services Committee. And then when it was being heard, the House made a few different adjustments to the bill. They removed certain items from the bill and they added some different items to the bill as well. And so just as a summary, some of the items that were originally included in the bill, a lot of those targeted workforce type items. For example, a lot of the temporary licenses under the BSRB last for 1 year, but for some professions, they last for 2 years. So one of the items would extend, or it would make us be able to offer temporary licenses that were 2 years instead of the current 1 year. So that would be something that would be able to help in terms of individuals if they were struggling to pass the licensure test or had an unusual situation come up that prevented them from taking the test. So they would have additional time to work under that temporary license. There was also a pretty significant change the board had requested to the reciprocity statutes for most of the professions. For a lot of the individuals who apply for reciprocity, the language in the statute says they either had to come from a jurisdiction with substantially equivalent license requirements, or otherwise they had to meet other requirements, and those other requirements indicated you had to work in a similar state scope of practice for basically 48 of the last 54 months. So basically you would have had to work in that state for about 4 years to qualify under that reciprocity distinction. The board recommended lowering that from 48 months to 12 months. And that's more in line with a bill that passed a couple of years ago that had to do with reciprocity for certain military members, military spouses, but it also included individuals who reside in Kansas. And so basically it lines up more consistently with that and would allow more people to come in through reciprocity a little easier. And there was also some additional language that provided some flexibility for individuals if they were coming upon the end of their license period and they had not completed their continuing education hours. They could request additional time to complete those hours, and if they could show extenuating circumstances for needing some additional time, if the board approved them, they could get up to 3 months of additional time to complete the hours. Now, this is not an extension of their license. They would still need to renew their license on time, but normally you wouldn't be able to renew your license unless your hours were complete. And so this would allow people to continue to stay licensed, which is good. And then there was also a way that individuals could come back to the professions if their license had expired in the past. We've heard from some people that they have been licensed, but because of perhaps their own health or someone close to them or professional burnout or another reason like this, they have allowed their license to expire. But for them to come back, the language in the statute said that they had to pay essentially double the license fee and then have all the continuing education hours from the prior period. And so to enable this to be a little bit more of an easy process to bring people back to the workforce who were already licensed previously, the board put in language to develop and establish a new 6-month temporary reinstatement license, where if individuals were still needing those continuing education hours, they could get this special 6-month temporary reinstatement license, be able to practice immediately, and then work up to 6 months while finishing those hours. And then once the hours were complete, they could have their permanent license fully reinstated. Additionally, for individuals who've been out of the profession for at least a year, they would be able to come back for half the cost of what it was before. So instead of paying twice the license fee, they would come back for just the normal license fee. So these were 2 steps that the board was looking at as common sense ways to bring people back to the workforce as a different, much of the conversation has been about looking at workforce and other things by looking at the front end of that process. But these are individuals that perhaps could help the workforce if they came back after being previously licensed. There was also a couple of other profession-specific items that are still in the version of the bill. One would be to develop a new type of temporary license for social work applicants who graduate from programs that are in the process of those programs becoming accredited. For the social work profession, that accreditation process can take 3 to 3.5 years, and they have a status called candidacy, which means that they have been accepted into a path and they're meeting check marks to become accredited. But based on the length of that accreditation process, you can have a situation where people graduate from that program while it's still seeking accreditation. And the question is, how should the BSRB be able to assist those people? And so following a model from Minnesota, it's establishment of a new type of temporary license. So if you graduate from a program that's in candidacy for accreditation through the social work profession, you would be able to get a temporary license. And then once your program reached accreditation status, then you could get a permanent license. So this resolves one of those issues that we have been working with the last few years. And then also for the addiction counseling profession, there was a new type of student temporary license, which the advisory committee had developed, similar to something called a counselor in training that existed many years ago under SRS. But it would be sort of a pathway for individuals who have about 60 hours towards an addiction counselor license, but they are still taking additional classes, and they would have an employer that would be willing to work with them, understanding that they would be willing to hire them upon completion of an addiction counselor license. And it would be a way for them to work under the student temporary license while they're on the path towards becoming a permanent licensee. There were some other technical cleanup items, one involving the licensed psychology profession in terms of changing their current language, which is having good moral character as a requirement of licensure, to meriting the public trust. For the behavior analyst profession, there were some changes that would make their disciplinary remedies more in sync with some of the other disciplinary remedies for the professions. And so there's also some legislative cleanup items that would make our processes more clear in the statutes. And so that was all put before the committee. The committee did remove 3 items from the bill. The House committee removed 1 item, which would have added board-approved requirement for the social work profession. So that item was removed from the bill. Additionally, the continuing education requirement that I talked about for cultural diversity, the House committee did remove that language as well. But while they did remove the language of the new 3-hour continuing education requirement, they wanted to recommend that the hours in diagnosis and treatment be lowered from 6 to 3, and beginning on January 1st of 2025. So they did make that recommendation, and that did hold and carry forward to the bill. Additionally, there was one other item that they had made a recommendation on, but basically the other items stayed in the bill. They added 3 new items. One was to basically create a new type of temporary license, more or less, for it's called a community-based license. It would last for up to 2 years. And this would be for, initially it was for people who work under the scope of employment for a community mental health center, but they further amended that language to make it open to individuals who work under the scope of employment at FQHCs, also psychiatric residential treatment facilities, and then other addiction treatment facilities that are identified in statute. And so that was a modification. They made some changes to the language and requirements for individuals seeking clinical licensure for the social work profession. And then there was another item that dealt with the BSRB operations. So basically, with the language in the bill, we would have to review any kind of application for license or permit or otherwise, and send a response back within 15 days to let the person know that we've received their information and to let them know what is complete or what's incomplete. And then once we have a complete file, we will be making decisions within 30 days. And then there's also some language for the board to establish an expedited license review process, and that will need to be developed in rules and regulations. That will be something the board will be working on as well. So ultimately, the bill passed the House. It went to the Senate. It passed the Senate. It went to conference committee because there were some minor changes the Senate made. And in conference committee, there weren't any new items that were brought up, but there were some language changes to a few different items. And ultimately, the bill was passed and signed into law. And so the effective date for the bill is July 1st. However, based on some of the technical aspects, it may be a little bit later than that by the time that we see some of those items. Now, we're not able to do any of them until July 1st because that's the effective date of the bill. But behind the scenes, we're working on putting together a message to inform licensees about all the changes from the bill. We're also working with looking at our forms, developing new forms for some of these items. We're working with our licensing vendor to make sure that we can start issuing some of these new types of licenses as well. And so it's a lot of work behind the scenes. And then, like I mentioned, we have authority to hire 2 new staff members to help us out with some of these additional responsibilities. And so, so all of these things are going to be something we're working on this month and also into the fall. But I just kind of wanted to let you know where that bill stood. We had talked about it before, and it had definitely changed a few times during the legislative session, but that bill did pass. And wanted to pause here to see if you had any questions about the BSRB bill.
Had just 2.
Okay, go ahead.
So on the first one, it pertains to that community-based license, and I might have just missed that while you were talking about it, but are these folks still now able to use the full credential title while they're only temporarily licensed?
Yes, and that was one of the issues that we had identified, and we had requested an amendment from the Senate to resolve that issue. But it was the legislative will to go ahead and keep that in there. So, and that applied to the non-clinical level of the professional counselor license, the bachelor's and master's level of the social work profession, also the marriage and family therapy license, the licensed psychology license, and then when it went to conference committee, they also added the master's level psychology license as well.
Was there a reason why? Do they just not understand what they're doing? Or, I mean, honestly, I just don't know if it was just they didn't hear from enough people. I listened to enough of these hearings to know sometimes they weren't even sure which bills they were referring to when they were making their comments. But I do wonder about that, because that it is bothersome to me to think that we now have even people at this. I mean, I would imagine the psychologists would be even, maybe they're not, but I think they'd be incredibly upset to have people calling themselves a licensed psychologist that's not even licensed yet. I mean, I think every profession likely would have a problem with this. So do you have any indication or idea of why it was that they went ahead with this without even considering what that would mean?
I definitely can't speak for the legislature, but I can say the advocates for this had informed me that one of the issues one of the reasons they wanted this was to resolve certain billing issues. Now I raised the same points that you raised, and you're right. Sometimes in committees there can be some confusion, and some of these things, they do deal with a great number of bills. But when
Sure.
what happened was this was added when the House worked the bill, so there really wasn't a chance to talk to the House committee about it, because the way they did it was they had a hearing and then they had a separate day just for recommendations. And when they did recommendations, they really don't open it up and allow comments from the public on the recommendations. So the House did it, and then once the House did it, I met with the leadership from that committee expressing concerns. And then when it moved through the House and it wasn't changed, then when it went to the Senate, it was scheduled for the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. And I personally went over to the Capitol and I scheduled time with every single member of the Senate committee and met with them one-to-one in their offices and provided them with copies of amendments. And I explained the issue, because in the actual hearing itself, ultimately they only ended up giving each of us about 2 minutes to talk publicly in the hearing. And so I realized if that was a situation, there was going to be no opportunity to really explain these things in the detail that they probably merit. So I had scheduled meetings with everyone, including the chair, vice chair, ranking minority member of the committee. And even in my testimony, I had copies of specific amendments and ways to address these things. And I explained what the issues were. And I was optimistic that they would make amendments either in that committee or when it went to conference committee, but they didn't. And so I really can't say in terms of why the legislature chose to do that. I definitely carried forward the issues that you expressed about the public protection aspect of it, and that this could be seen as misleading. From the BSRB perspective, I would not want us to be seen as possibly assisting with putting something forward that might confuse the public. And so ultimately, we don't handle anything like reimbursements here in our office. That's done through other agencies like the Department for Aging and Disability Services and the Department of Health and Environment. So when it looked like the bill could pass, I reached out to representatives from both of those agencies and I said, I want you to fully understand these things and I want you to know about them in advance too. I said, we're hopeful that there will be changes because we see some real significant issues here. But in case it does go into effect, I don't want there to be any confusion about these new individuals if they're able to use those credentials, because I want you to be aware that we have individuals who use those that have met all the requirements for licensure, including passing the license examination. And now you will have these new individuals who have not passed the license examination, but according to the law, they will be able to use those initials and those labels. So I honestly don't think I could have done any more in terms of talking to the legislature, but I can't speak for why they made the decision they did.
Okay, I appreciate the work that you did, and I think the issue probably there were more folks on the other side advocating for this than there were people bringing awareness to the problem that this brought on. And I think part of the issue is it was not known about the way these recommendations were being made. Like I said, I know I found out about them the day that I was there for the Senate hearing that got canceled, and I was like, wait a second, what's going on? And by that time, it's like that it was already in the works. I do get, it makes me wonder too about the idea of like almost feels fraudulent, even from an insurance perspective, to have people listing titles that they don't actually possess, just so they can bill insurance. It'd be like, I mean, it's legal in the sense that they can do that, but it'd be like person representing themselves as a LCPC when they're LPC, just so they can work with another company. But it's legal here now, but so that's just my concern. There's lots of concerns I have about that I think have to be dealt with. The other one has to do with the diagnosis and treatment component. I recall the social work advocates that were there talking about a few different things, and I know they discussed the diagnosis and treatment component for their end of things. Were those two separate, like in terms of the keeping hours? I know that we had the recommendation, or at least the recommendation of the board, was to reduce our diagnosis and treatment by 3 and have 3 hours of the DEI, like the cultural diversity competency or CEs in there. That wasn't put in there, but then the social work folks were talking about diagnosis and treatment too, but I think those might have been unrelated topics. Okay. What is the general requirement? Do we know, I guess, do we know? Because I had concerns when I saw that getting reduced, because again, I think I've said this before, I feel like I fear people aren't great at diagnosing to begin with. And so reducing the hours that we require worries me too. Because I think people do a lot more stuff on the treatment end, but then so much treatment is driven by proper diagnosis that without proper diagnosis, then our treatments may be improperly used, failing to come up with a better word at the moment. So do other states only require 3? Is that why we suggested 3? Was it only because we were trying to not require more mandatory CEs in terms of the 6 that we already had, that we went with reducing by 3? I was just wanting to make sure I understood that in its entirety.
Yeah, so first about the social work profession, there was another modification that the House made specifically just for the social work statutes for clinical applicants. There's certain hours you have to get in terms of postgraduate hours, and you need to get 3,000 hours, including 1,500 hours diagnosing and treating. And one of the changes they made for the social work profession was to change the wording of that part of the statute, so that instead of it said you would do 3,000 hours, including 1,500 hours doing diagnosis and treatment, it would say 1,500 hours, including but not limited to diagnosing and treating, which really opens it up to other categories. And we're trying to resolve kind of how to evaluate that new language, because when you say that you have to get 1,500 hours doing this, it's pretty easy to understand. You say 1,500 hours, including but not limited to this, what is the new standard? And so that's one thing we're really wrestling with. Also, for that statute, there was previously 5 identified courses that were to be a requirement to make sure that people who were going to be able to diagnose and treat had education doing that specifically. And what the legislature did was to remove the specific reference to 4 of the 5 classes and strike that down from about 1,500 hours in that category down to 3 hours in that category. And there were some other changes too concerning the language of the practicum. But what they said about that was, they said there are some individuals who had difficulty meeting those requirements, and they believed that if there was a program that was accredited by the National Accrediting Body for Social Work, that should be sufficient, and that they didn't see the value in having those standards specifically. But I agree that one of the concerns that the Social Work Advisory Committee had after hearing about those adjustments was that these would be individuals that would be able to do that independently, and that's why we had those requirements to ensure they had education and experience doing that before they became independent practitioners. And so we raised that issue. We requested an amendment on that to deal with that, but it was not picked up. In terms of the continuing education item, so basically what I did in the fall, the board had an all-day planning meeting and looked at their legislative goals and an agenda. And I compared what we currently require for continuing education compared to a lot of other states. And I was looking to see overall number of hours and then also specific categories. And in terms of the number of overall hours, it seemed like we were pretty consistent with most other states. In terms of the number of specific categories, we require 3 hours in ethics, and it seems like I believe every state has a requirement of ethics for continuing education. Then the other requirement is for those licenses that are able to diagnose and treat, they have to get 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment every 2 years. But in comparing that to what other states require for continuing education, that was pretty rare in terms of what other states require in that area. But there were some other requirements in other states, things like cultural diversity type training, or suicide prevention training, or working with veterans. There were a number of subcategories that some other states required in different specialty areas. And so one of the ideas the board discussed was, if the 6 hour requirement in diagnosis and treatment is a bit unusual compared to other states, would it be beneficial to lower that and then require hours in a different area? And so they considered a few different options, but ultimately the board decided to reduce those from 6 to 3, and in exchange have this new 3 hour requirement in cultural diversity. And so the legislature, instead of rejecting that item together, they basically said, we don't want to add a new 3 hour requirement in cultural diversity, but we will go ahead and we want to lower those hours from 6 to 3 separately. So the board's position was more that it was two things together, and the legislature said, we will take the part that lowers it, but not the other part. And I think, just based on the comments, it seems like a lot of the discussion is about workforce, and any kind of thing that could be perceived as an additional requirement is facing a lot of, it's not being well received right now. But even though it's lowering by 3 and adding 3, they just decided they would reject the adding 3 and keep or do the 3 lowering by itself. So that's kind of what happened with that discussion.
So what you're saying is that the board needs to be really careful about what recommendations they make with the knowledge that you have at the moment, because I understand workforce piece. I heard that's how advocates for the community-based licensure kept putting this out. This is a workforce bill. It's the language I kept hearing people use to sell it to the legislators. But public safety and competence are also important when it comes to our workforce. And especially, I can only speak for counseling, but maintaining the view of being relevant professionals that know what we're doing and that take the steps. I know that only having 3 required doesn't mean we can't do more than that. I mean, I get that, but I think that it just sounds like with whatever recommendations are made in the future, it's going to be really important for us to consider how the legislature anytime might look at these things or how they're talked about, to make sure we're not, I don't mind us being more in line with folks, but I also want to make sure that we have competent people. So I guess that's what I'm hearing, is we just got to be careful with what we put forward and how we put it forward.
Andrew, I think the board was very conscious of putting things forward that did not misrepresent the profession nor the qualifications of people who are seeking treatments. I think we were there's only so much we could do when representing the public. That's all I talk about, is what is the public's impression. And I think there was just this rush, I'll use my term, not the board's term, rush to inclusion and bring more bodies able to take care of mental health needs in the community that maybe got way in front of itself this time. And it didn't seem like it was something we could stop. I know David tried. I mean, he was giving, sometimes we were getting 3 days a week updates on what was going on, what he was hearing, which was very informative to us, but then we just make phone calls, and it was actually very hard to get through to people in the legislature for a phone call. You had to be camped out. So
Yeah, I'm not faulting the board at all. I think the board probably was very conscientious about what they put forward. I'm thinking what we saw this year, maybe from the legislature, maybe it was just this year, is just an indication of the work that more than just David is going to have to do, I guess, in terms of who all, when we find out about these things, is speaking on behalf of this end of things, because of the legislature, and is hearing from other folks to move things forward, and then is willing to make adjustments like they did. Then we have to be even more mindful of being advocates for this work too, to make sure that it's at least all out there. David's one person. I know he does a great job, but he's one person.
Yeah, no, I wasn't at all thinking you were faulting the board. I just want to say the board was right in step with the thoughts you expressed about legitimate concerns about pushing this forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that comment.
I do agree with you that advocacy is the key. I mean, the legislature clearly responds when there are more bodies up in front of them testifying and talking about what matters. And it's clear that we just need to be, whenever we can, on top of that and doing it. I testified at a couple of things, but I know there are more things I can do. And I will certainly be, one thing David and I have talked about is a little bit of, we didn't use the word strategic plan, but I think that's basically informally what it is, about how to really be sure we're out in front of things, in front of the legislature.
Well, and some of the comments the legislature had made last year, and I, as much as possible, we want to have good working relationships with everyone. But it seems like a lot of the comments that they had made in the fall was they wanted agencies, specifically health agencies, to bring forward a proposal and a bill to work with the legislature to try to help make things better. And I think for the items in the board, the board brought forward, many of them, one of the focuses was on workforce, but there was also some public protection specific items in there as well. And when I talked to the committees, one thing I tried to make clear was that, this is not just me coming before you. It's, I work for a 12-member board, but it's not just the 12 members in the board either. We have 7 professions, and we have an advisory committee for each of these professions. And so a lot of these recommendations have been discussed by, the 55 other people that serve on those advisory committees. And so it's really a large group. And then, they talk to people. But yeah, in terms of those committees, sometimes just seeing bodies and hearing directly from people does have a big impact. I really wanted to work with members of the legislature to make sure that we advanced both the workforce items and the public protection items. But a lot of the public protection items the board brought forward, the legislature removed from the bill and then kept the other items. And so I think in terms of new legislation, if the board would want to bring forward a bill next year, I will definitely try to send out information to make sure that people, as much as possible, sometimes these hearings are scheduled Monday morning and we hear about it late Thursday. So sometimes there's very little to no turnaround time. But if I can, I will try to make you all aware of things in advance, because I do think if you have the opportunity, or if you know individuals who would have the opportunity to speak at those items or those hearings, it would be helpful too. So for my part, I will take another step forward to try to make sure that more people have information, even if there's very little turnaround time, because I think we want to make sure that, Andrew, like what you were talking about, we want to make sure that we advance the public protection mission of the board. And if that can be helped by having more support, I'm definitely in favor of that.
Yeah, I found, and I'll be done with this. I found like we were trying to talk about balance between like workforce and public protection. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of a rhythm, right? Or dance between them. Like we have to do stuff that serves both, even though I know we're in the business of public safety, public protection. At the same time, things that we do benefit our professionals too. We don't want to do things that are so restrictive that we don't have people come into our state to work. So I recognize there's a dance between those two. And I think it's just finding that we all have maybe more of an active effort in how we help bring that to awareness, to help carry that message. So I appreciate the work you did, and Laura and others on the board for the work that they did and put forward. And it's a good learning experience for us for the coming year. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, for all your comments and concerns.
Well, in terms of other legislative updates, there's two other items. One, I'm sure you all are well aware of, the passage of 2288. That was the multi-state compact for professional counseling. So very excited that bill has passed. And the board, so the bill itself has an effective date of July 1st, 2023. So while the bill has passed, we are not exactly officially a member of the compact yet, but we very shortly will be. And in preparation for that, the board was able to go ahead and appoint a commissioner for the state of Kansas to serve as compact commissioner. So at the last board meeting, the board appointed Laura Shaughnessy to serve as compact commissioner. So very excited about that. And I think Laura will do an excellent job. We've already been talking, and she's planning to attend some of those commission meetings and be an active member of the compact commission. So one thing we're going to try to send something out about, there has been a little confusion. I think some people are very excited about the compact and are very eager to get a privilege to practice. And they are still working on the infrastructure of that compact. And so we won't be able to start issuing those privileges to practice probably sometime until either the very late fall of this year or perhaps the beginning of the spring of next year. And that really has to do with they're still setting up their technical infrastructure and making sure that we have a good system in place for that. But as soon as we can move forward with that, we're looking forward to doing that. And then the legislature also passed Senate Bill 66, and that is a bill that essentially had to do with the legislature was interested in creating a one-stop shop for license verification, and it was discussed as primarily being helpful for military members and military spouses, but essentially they wanted to have one place that you could go and check on a professional license for someone in the state of Kansas. And so this is not going to change the verification portal we have on the BSRB website, but we will be basically working with the group that is building this new system to make sure that our information can be accessible through that verification portal. And so we'll be working with them to figure out all the details of that. But that is something new that we're working on behind the scenes. And then in terms of items from the last board meeting, I did want to say congratulations to the members of the advisory committee that were appointed to serve another 2-year term. And as you may recall, advisory committees serve 2-year terms. Some of those are staggered. So if any members weren't up this year, they would be up next year. But the members that were reappointed at the last board meeting were Harriet Bachner, Michelle Fairbank, Bob Kircher, Andrew Secor, and Adil Torres Rivera. And so really appreciate all of your continued service on the advisory committee and look forward to continuing to work with you all for the next couple of years.
I second that.
Yes. The board also received proposed unprofessional conduct regulation changes from the different advisory committees. That's something that you all had worked on last year and a little bit more this spring. Each of the advisory committees was tasked to review and work through their unprofessional conduct regulations and consider possible recommended changes. So those were all provided to the board. But now that we have a packet from each of the board advisory committees, we are distributing them back to the advisory committees so you can be reminded of the changes you recommended, but also for context, see the changes the other advisory committees recommended too. And so that may be more of a homework assignment between now and the next meeting, but it's on your agenda a little bit later. But the idea is that each of these groups looked at these separately and you didn't have identical recommendations or identical bases to match to start this process, but perhaps there can be some items from the other advisory committees that you may want to add as a new recommended change to your professional conduct regulations. And then also the board, as I mentioned, we had an offsite planning meeting last year. The board informed me they would like to continue to have this and that we're going to be planning this, and it was just set. So the board's offsite planning meeting is going to be on Monday, October 23rd. So we're working on logistics for that and still trying to identify the specific location, but I've already been speaking with a few different vendors. And so hopefully we'll have that confirmed here pretty shortly, but that should be all day on Monday, October 23rd. And then there will be some changes to board membership. So each board member that's appointed by the governor serves a 4-year term, and those are staggered appointments. And board members can serve up to 2 terms. And so we have 3 board members that we expect will be leaving the board. at the end of June. Deb Stidham, who serves as the board member for addiction counseling, she will be ending her second term on the board, so we anticipate that she will be ending her service on the board at the end of June. Rick Steele is one of the board members for licensed psychology, and he is ending his first term, but he has some other commitments, so he's decided to step away from the board. And then Jonna Norton is a public member, and similarly, she's ending her first term and is kind of stepping away to go ahead and take care of some other items. And so, but just wanted to make you aware of those 3 board members that will be coming off, and the governor, we expect, will appoint new members at least by July 1st. And so their first meeting will be the board meeting in July, but we will post updates and information on the new members of the board as soon as we know. We'll post that on the board's website. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
Okay. Sounds like you are done for a little while, David. Well, I say that, now we're going to move on to old business, so let's go ahead with that. The first thing is discussion on changes to clinical training plans. And David, of course, that's you again.
Yeah, and Leslie may want to add something on this item too when we talk about it, but in your packet of material, you have a copy of KAR 102-3-7A. And this is the regulation specifically on postgraduate supervised professional experience required to be a clinical professional counselor. And we've had a conversation recently with the board concerning one of the items for the professions for your regulations. That's all the way down on the second page of that regulation, item H. So item H, well, just as a little bit of context. So anyone who is seeking clinical licensure, one of the requirements before they accrue their hours is to submit a training plan to the board and have that reviewed and approved. And so item H on here says all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within that 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And one of the issues with this, I guess there's 2 things the board wanted the advisory committees to discuss and provide some recommendations or feedback on. First, so the phrase on here says all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. And the question is what really constitutes a change and what types of changes really need to be reported. Because if you change supervisor, or if you change employment, some of those are changes that you would definitely want to report to the board. But the board was essentially what happens from time to time is someone will seek licensure, they'll have an approved training plan, and when they come to the end of the time period, they will submit their hours. And if there were modifications they made that they did not report based on this regulation, they would lose those hours. And so ultimately the board has to review to determine if it's a significant enough change that it would fit under this regulation. And so the board is hoping to basically identify some specific changes that we could add to the regulation to add more visibility on this, so that individuals would be better informed what specific changes they need to report, and then also to provide some assistance to our staff, and to when we have questions from the public, we want to be able to know how to advise people when they're trying to get their hours completed. And then the second item was the 45-day requirement. If the items would have been items that would have been approved, it's a pretty significant impact if you lose all those hours that you didn't report within the 45 days. And so is there an alternative to this current language on the 45-day requirement? And so that's something the board wanted to have discussed as well. And so in terms of the frequency that this comes up, it doesn't come up all that frequently, but when it does come up, the consequences are pretty severe. And ultimately, we want to be helpful for the public. We don't want to be punitive. We want to make sure that we have good standards, but we also want to make sure that we're working with people who are trying to do the right thing on these items. So wanted to defer it to you to see if you could have some discussion on this item concerning the types of changes that could be added to the regulation, and perhaps if there's any ideas you have concerning an alternative to the 45-day reporting requirement language.
Any ideas or feedback?
Is there a thought that the 45 days is unreasonable or?
So that was my question, how they came out with the 45 days, versus anything else.
So I think what some people have asked is if it's the change that would have been approved, is that, should there be a distinction, or should there be some flexibility, which says, you should submit change to the board within 45 days, but if you fail to submit them after 45 days, then the board may decline those hours. There's just different options of going on this one, but I think the issue is what is the 45-day requirement trying to accomplish? And I think what it's trying to accomplish is to make sure that people aren't wasting their time by making changes and then doing something that wouldn't count. But this 45-day requirement basically would say whether it would be something that would be approved or not. It's more of a technical issue that if you don't submit it, and I think it's supposed to provide motivation for people to submit those hours for review and approval,
Right.
but it does have a pretty big impact.
It seems to me like anything that's not applicable to providing the services shouldn't prohibit them. Like their personal address change, even their name change wouldn't be anything that changes or impacts who they're serving or the type of service they're providing, which would be that's really the concern, is if they start working with a whole new population and that's not approved or even aware. So I would think if we could write it in where it was, again, if they move, I don't see how that has any impact on services or the clients or anything to do with their work.
Now, are you talking about their personal address or their place of employment in terms of the address?
Well, I was thinking just their personal address, because that's a requirement, right, that they have to update, or if that's their business address. But even their business, if it moves, doesn't really change unless they change employers.
Well, we do have several of the cases that have gone before the board were people who were working in a specific agency and changed positions in that agency and didn't notify the board. So there needs to be some clear language or about that.
When you say they change positions, they changed from being a therapist to being something else?
Yes. So some say that they took a more administrative role, but they continued to see clients. Some changed positions from a therapist to a crisis intervention or things like of that nature. So it may change the population that they're seeing.
I would think if it changed the population, it would make sense to me. I think if someone moves from a therapist to a supervisor, but they still see the same clients that they were seeing before, like they kept their caseload, that doesn't change the work you're doing. I mean, the work that they're counting towards clinical hours.
So I'll give you two examples. So one of them was I had a supervisee who was a milieu therapist in a setting, and her employer added some family therapy responsibilities onto her role. And so when her position officially changed is when she notified the board that she had been changed to the family therapist. But the BSRB said that she should have reported when the new responsibilities for doing family work got added, even though she was still in the same position, and her hours were not allowed to be counted and up until the date of that approval. So her position didn't change. Her employer has the right to add responsibilities to her position, but she didn't notify the board at that stage, and so she lost those hours. I think there's an issue there. where there's not, like, it's not a position change or anything. It's just an employer adding responsibility, and there's not. So if we're saying any changes, even if your employer adds a new responsibility, then, I mean, we got to list examples of what that may be. Yeah, I usually try to tell my supervisees, like, if you're changing stuff, you probably want to make sure you don't need to let somebody know. Even that one, I thought, well, she's still in the same job, same position. Her boss just added a couple things to her to do during the week. She was seeing a few people for family. So I could see a substantive change where it's like I go from doing milieu work to doing family therapy, where the board would want to review that work job requirement to make sure that the person's still providing services. Because the issue you run into, Leslie, going to your point, that we've run into is that we have had people go from working in a private practice or an outpatient clinic who then get jobs at a hospital being an assessor. And the requirement is that they have to be conducting therapy throughout the entirety of the training plan. So if they're not conducting, if they're in a role where they're no longer doing therapy, the BSRB has said to them that, well, the person reviewing the application has said that there's a chance that they will not be able to meet the requirement for independent licensure because they would not have met the requirement to be practicing therapy for the entirety of the training plan. So there's a reason why certain positions need to be reviewed, even if it's a move within the same company, to ensure that that person's job aligns with the statutes or regulations regarding clinical licensure. Because that is a pretty big difference of the person's no longer doing therapy at all and only did 6 months of therapy. And the other time they were doing assessment, but no counseling. So
is it possible then to indicate in the change that as long as the changes, take the therapists away from doing therapy? Because for me, if the therapy is the kind of therapy that, like you said, somebody's seeing families versus seeing individuals, boy, I just feel like that's a little. I don't know. I just feels like, wait, if this person is seeing individuals versus couples or families, they're still doing therapy. So for me, moving from actually seeing clients to doing administrative work or just doing assessment, like you said, that's a little different. So if we define the kind of changes, like changes that take away somebody from actually seeing clients, having direct contact with clients, I think for me that would be the main difference that would make sense. Anything else just looks like, we're making it a little too complicated. Just my take.
Yeah, you're all pointing toward, we just need to have more specifics, and the specifics that will count toward as many challenges as possible. Do we want to make that list now, or is that something we want to work on an ongoing basis for a little while?
I think either way is fine. I can tell you what, there's an advisory committee that met on Friday and they had a little discussion on this topic as well. So maybe I can share kind of what they had worked on, and maybe that can be a base for your comments. Definitely don't have to go the same direction, but maybe it'd be helpful for context. So the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee discussed this topic too. And what they were sort of in favor was to add language that instead of saying all changes, it would say substantial or all substantial changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval, including but not limited to setting, type of clients, and supervisor. So those were the items that they initially had discussed. But they also recommended that at the end of that regulation where it says, if the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within the 45-day period, so instead of saying no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice, it would say the board or something about those hours may be denied. So it would change it from a shall to allow the board a little bit of flexibility. So, so the board could deny those hours or would be able to potentially count them, but that's not a firm recommendation. They were going to continue to think about that, but I think they want to provide the board some flexibility instead of leaving it with the current shall language. So that's what they had talked about.
I think that this probably go back to what was earlier, Andrew was discussing in terms of credibility. I think that because I like that language, which is specific enough, and also good enough team to hold responsible. Because I think that every time you have some changes in population, every time you have changes of place, every time you have some changes with supervisor, you know, that change the complete plan. You know, supervision style and supervision approach is different from every. So I think that every time it changes, that's going to affect the rest of the plan. Yeah, you know, so I think that that's about the credibility and we talk about the information. So I'd like to have, you know, like that language, you know, and the idea that just my opinion.
Thank you. Also adding a change in or addition to current duties. Yeah. I like the clarity of that, and also the flexibility from will be denied to may be denied, because then again, that allows the board to get in there and listen to specific cases and be flexible.
And I can tell you, you know, I've tried to do a little comparison between what we have versus what other states have. And at least in the area of supervision, I can't say for sure that there is a set standard between all the different states. Now we have 7 professions, so there's going to be some differences for sure. But there are some states that basically say you don't even have to submit a training plan in advance. You just accrue your hours, you keep track of them, and you turn them all in at the end. I'm not saying I recommend that, because I think that leaves open a lot of potential that you turn in your hours, you didn't do it correctly, and then you lose all of the hours, which would be problematic for sure. Other ones have something where other states have a system where essentially you are submitting hours as you go, and one even has an electronic process, and so you'll be constantly submitting hours. I'm not sure that's the best method either, because it seems like that would be a lot of work for those individuals and a lot of work from my staff as well. So we're trying to resolve an issue here and make things better, but we don't necessarily overly complicate things unless it's helpful. So.
That just the continuous reporting of hours, we had looked at like every 6 months or once a year, that the supervisor would fill out a form attesting to how many hours and if the person's doing what they're, you know, meeting the requirements, because there are people who get to the end and their supervisor doesn't recommend them, and it seems like a surprise to them. So that was one of the reasons that we had talked about, staff had talked about the reporting hours as you go along.
Yeah.
But it would be more work.
Well, and if the interval was right, it could be a balance between not too much work, but definitely accountability. You know, in the corporate world, that's MBO, management by objective. There should be no surprises at the end if there have been check-ins throughout the entire process.
Exactly.
Which is good for everybody. I like that idea.
So is the purpose of this then just to make sure that people aren't doing something that they're not, I know, approved to do, but I would look at it and say the idea is, so public safety, the idea is that we're trying to ensure that people are not practicing in places that they may not be qualified, or I would even say they're not able to be supervised properly in. Because you might have a supervisor that is able to supervise one role the person's in, but if that person's position changes, that supervisor might not be the most competent person to supervise that new responsibility anymore, in which case there would have to be at least a conversation between a supervisor and the supervisee, which this process would initiate. My thing is, I just don't want to hurt people unnecessarily. Like, for instance, my supervisee, I really don't think her hours shouldn't have been awarded because of just her boss giving her some additional responsibility. You know, it was, I mean, especially if the training plan includes the fact the person's going to potentially do family work as part of their training plan. Other than, I mean, there was no change. I mean, the position hadn't changed. She said that that was likely something that may be part of it. If she were to say that, I have to go back and look at the plan to see if that said that or not. But if it did, I look at that and I think, what were we protecting in that sense? At the same time, I think it's important that we know what kind of work people are doing, because it may not be a good fit. We want to make sure people can't come back later and say, well, why didn't anybody tell me? So when we say even substantive changes, I'm like, you have to define that even. Like, what does substantive mean? Substantive is going to mean something different to everybody. So I think the main thing is I just don't want people to be penalized for things that really aren't, that I think should be penalized issues. So whatever that may look like. But the board has a responsibility to be informed. Especially, I think even addresses, right? I mean, if somebody's doing something, the board needs to be able to know how to contact people to provide information to them. Should they lose their hours for not doing that? No, I mean, but I think there's other ways that we should, in terms of their personal home address, unless they're private practice and that's their address, in which case that would be a substantive change. If they move and their new practice address is wherever their new home is, but so I just want to make sure whatever we do is not penalizing people unnecessarily.
Well, and I think
No, as a public member of the board, I believe that the change from shall to may will give the board a lot of flexibility so that we can have these conversations. And so as we move forward, as this committee moves forward to consider that change, it's important to give us flexibility so we can listen to people, whether it's a hearing or just talk amongst ourselves to decide, well, what is really a substantive change? And you're all the professionals. I just stand here trying to help the public and make sure they're protected. So thanks for your comment.
Thank you.
But Andrew and Jim, I agree with both of you, in terms of, I think one of the goals here is to make sure that we are actually serving a good purpose in these changes. Because I do think, one of the things is there can be some confusion about this, and the board is held to enforce the statutes and regulations, and the staff is held to do that too. And so if it says all changes, if we agree with it or disagree with it, if it's there, we have to enforce it. But we also have some flexibility to make modifications. We just have to make sure that whatever we have, we're enforcing consistently. And so I think that's one of the true aims to this.
I will say Joan is great, and I've spoke with Joan many, many times. And so this is not anything towards Joan or anybody, because they do their jobs well. At least I know Joan does. I speak with her a lot. So I recognize that I know what answers I'm going to get from Joan when I call. And so we get through the stuff, and then we have our conversation. But the board does a good job. I think that, like Jim said, the changing of a words matter, and so that flexibility would be good. But Joan and everybody else, I know they're doing their jobs as good as they can. So
I have one more thought. Just want to put together what Andrew said and what was said before about because substantial can mean pretty much anything. How about we say, kind of just giving some words to put together here. So substantial changes affecting client contact and competent supervision. And I think those are the main things that we're looking at: competent supervision, client contact, because that's where usually supervisors have a lot of trouble having client contact hours. And many times those are the ones that we are very concerned about that. And then of course, competent supervision. So that's just because I think if we define a little bit, I'm afraid to be too prescriptive, because if we start aligning things, then we're going to leave some things out. Then they become very difficult. Some of this wasn't part of it. But if we just focus on substantial changes affecting client contact and competent supervision, then those ones, that gives us a broad spectrum and also flexibility, while taking care of public and competency, those two things together. So
Thank you.
that's my thought. Thank you.
What would you think about adding examples include but are not limited to, something like that? Changes in setting, types of clients.
My fear is that when you start adding specifics, then you're going to leave something out that's important. But if you leave it this general, because you're looking at client contact hours and you're looking at competence supervision. That's why I was making that suggestion. But anyway, maybe somebody else has an idea there.
Well,
I
not
have
li-
a concern if you start adding examples, then I agree with Acha that may leave things out or be even more confusing.
like people,
So I like the changes that Acha made, and I strongly support the addition of may rather than shall.
so you don't think examples would help to, to gather some of those top problems that come up in the situations? You don't feel like listing them would be helpful?
I think you could list examples that just says like, these are things we'd be looking for, and it's not an all-inclusive list. But I also understand what Harriet and Acha are saying is that if there's a difference between offering examples and being prescriptive in terms of saying, these are the things we want to know, because we just can't know all of the things that would be there, but we could say, here are some ideas. This is not an all-inclusive list. If you're unsure, contact the board, or contact, Joan or your licensure specialist, because that you can't go wrong there. So I think you can add ideas to get people like, what would be considered this, without prescribing that these are the things, because then you still leave it open. And so I think there's ways to do that, but I understand the concern. Prescribing means, well, that's what people are going to think it is. Like that's all I need to get a hold of.
Yeah, there would need to be an emphasis on this is not limited to.
It's like the DSM when they went from, they added examples all throughout to like try to increase enter rate or reliability among diagnosing. They added examples, and there are people that'll say like, here's some things to look for. So I agree with what everybody's saying. I just want to make sure it's useful. I want to make sure it's not penalizing people unnecessarily. And I also want to make sure that we're helping our practitioners know what's expected of them, so that way we don't have surprises. And then want to make sure the board can operate efficiently too.
Well, and when I think about the staff being able to operate efficiently, looking at the top 4 or 5 reasons that hours are denied, to me, it would be important to name some of that, so that people can understand and maybe be a little bit more in front of avoiding the main things that are going to deny their hours. Any other feedback about this? So we have a choice. Do we want to agree on something today and have David move it forward, or do we want to look at this over a little bit of time? We have time to think about this. Any ideas?
I think if we let it wait, other committees are looking at the same question. And I think if David continues to communicate his thoughts or his feelings about what other committees have done, giving us that feedback might help us continue to build on what we want to put forth as a final kind of thing.
I think the inclusion of the word may be one thing that we could make some decision on.
Go ahead and agree on that. Yeah. Oh, so David, we've got May. We can agree on May. And then it sounds to me like at our next meeting, which will be in August, will you come back with more feedback about how other committees are looking at this, and then we can decide then?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Anybody else have any comments today? Okay, well, thank you for the discussion. Okay, next thing is regulation review.
Okay, so at the last meeting, I kind of asked each of the advisory committees to look at 2 specific regulations. Most of the professions have each of these. There is a regulation on continuing education, KAR 102-3-10A, and then separately, there is a companion regulation, KAR 102-3-11A, documentation for continuing education. The continuing education regulation was last updated back in 2003, and the documentation for continuing education was last updated back in 1997. So both of these definitely could use some review. The idea is that technology has changed quite a bit since the last time both of these were modified. And so the first regulation identifies the number of hours. It also talks about methods of accruing continuing education. And so wanted to get your thoughts on any of potential language changes, if there's anything that you believe should be added, if it should be modified, or if it should be removed from either of these regulations, or if there's any updating that you have in terms of recommended changes to both of these.
Okay. Any feedback? Did everybody good? Oh, go ahead.
I was wondering, under number 8, how does that one, how do we count that? Because, like, for instance, I do supervision, faculty supervision to graduate, practicum and intern students. So we can't count more than 10 hours, but how do we count the hours? Is that based on 10 hours of supervision? Is that based off of what I get from my load unit? If it's outside of, if it's like a person that's doing that in a, like in an actual practice setting, like, is that 10 hours of action? I mean, what is that? How do we determine that continuing education units for that?
So, some universities will provide a letter for someone who's supervising practicum students. They'll provide a letter to the board saying that they did this many hours. We usually say it's hour for hour, or you can have so many per semester if you're doing practicum or internship students.
Gotcha. So, like, for me, if I'm supervising a dyad of students once a week all year, I basically just count the first 10 hours, and that 10 hours of supervision counts for CE.
Yes.
And I just have to have a letter that somebody would provide that says that I did that, or?
Well, I haven't actually reviewed your documentation in a while, so I would have to look.
I think it may say something about a syllabus.
Right.
That would be one way to do it.
I do group supervision of practicum and intern students in class too, which I'd have a syllabus for. And then I have my load sheet from the university that shows what that I'm doing that work. But I was just curious.
It's in H in the other regulation for documentation. It says written verification from the university practicum or intern instructor or other official training director that the licensee supervised undergraduate or graduate students, or from the supervisee that the licensee provided supervision.
And where is that at?
It's in the second regulation.
Oh, okay.
-3-11A, H as in hat.
Oh, I see it. Yeah, I got you there.
One thing we talked a lot about in the others was, we require original signatures for certificates. And that's not a very common practice anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And people can't, if we keep to that, people can't, submit by electronically, because they have to submit the original certificates. And if you do your CEUs online, even with the post test, obviously it's a copy of a certificate. It's not an original signature. So that was something that we had been looking at in the other committee. And as staff, we've talked about it.
ACA doesn't send an electronic copy of the certificate of application. You don't need a copy.
I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the ACA, when you go to the convention, ACA, they do not give you any hard copy. Everything, the computer education are electronic.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So PDF copies, electronic is really
Mhm.
the question, of course. Yeah, we're modernizing that.
Would it be possible, like I see up here under, so this is in 102-3-10. Hey, it's the first one, the really long one.
Mhm.
It says under number 2, it has language where it says you'll get continuing education credit on the basis of the actual contact time spent attending the course. Would it be possible to add that language too under number 8 for the intern or practicum student supervision, where it says like that you would receive time for the actual contact time you spend providing supervision up to that 10 hours, like, because I think that might clarify how we're counting that time, like that one. And number 2 clarifies how it's being counted, because sometimes you get one graduate credit hour equals 15 hours of CE,
Right.
whereas other times you get the actual time spent. So if it was a 15-hour class, you get 15 hours of CE. So it may be helpful to add that language under number 8, just to clear up how we're counting those 10 hours.
Okay.
I did get a question about that. That's why I was saying that from somebody.
Anybody have a different idea about that change? Seems like a good clarification to add.
I don't want to make any changes to how we allow for online stuff to be done, because like I'm a registered play therapist. Like the Association for Play Therapy only permits, they require contact hours, which means you have to be in person to do work. So like there's a portion you can do that's non-contact, and then the other part you have to be in person somewhere to do it. And there's limited workshops necessarily to complete that stuff. So if that comes up, do we want to make any changes to, should we allow less online to count? I would say no. So I know nobody's suggesting that, but if that conversation happens elsewhere, I'm saying it mainly for like, if that comes up, should we reduce that number? I would not want to do that. I think you can do good because they don't even allow for like, if it's a live online session, so you're attending at the time with a presenter, that still doesn't count as contact time for APT, because it's not in person, like physically in the same space. So I would not be for any changes, and that would go that direction. That would make it much more difficult for people to complete CEs and also to access really useful CEs through other entities.
Sure. Okay, thank you for that.
So Andrew, I was wondering about that. Why would play therapy say that? Are they afraid? Is it like you can't play online or something? I don't know.
I'm not sure. I've been curious about that too. I just haven't asked them why they have that. They loosened it during COVID, and then they went back. I think the start of this year, they went back to requiring at least I think at least 12 of your 24 hours have to be contact in person. So I don't know why. I'd have to ask them. I am good if it doesn't have a post test. I think that we should limit the amount of hours people can get if there's no post test. I mean, I think that a post test at least makes people spend some time looking at things. So
I agree with that. Anything else? So David and Leslie, did you note the mentioning of PDFs and electronic documentation will be accepted?
So for this profession, most of KAR 102-3-11A does allow for copies. The other profession we talked about on Friday, it basically said a copy would not be accepted, but I think your regulation doesn't include that language. So,
No, it does in the audit regulation though.
okay.
So we'll have to look for all the professions. We'll have to look at the audit regulation.
Okay, maybe we can add that as part of this process too.
Yeah.
Could you explain real quick before we move on, what's the difference? Like, what's a self-directed learning project? How would that be? What is that?
So honestly, I'm not very clear on that. I've approved, I think, 2 since I've been here for 24 years. There, like a group of people were doing some specific type of therapy. They were reading and going to trainings and then getting together and discussing it and, you know, things like that. But there's no written requirement for that. So it's really sort of open. I think the addiction counselors were discussing taking that out. They didn't make a decision, but they were talking about that as well.
I was saying, there's only been 2 of those in 24 years you've been
Yeah.
there. I was just wondering that if that's something we,
We need it, right?
yeah.
Doesn't sound like it's a trend we need to pay attention to.
No, that's for sure.
Well, I think if there's no more thoughts on these ones today, just continue to review them and continue to think about if there's new language, because I'm sure some of the technology references from 1997, we could probably update with some more broad terms to make sure that we're covering things that, you know, are more of common vernacular now. But also be thinking, if you have a chance, just think about if there's anything else that's not currently listed under continuing education as a method of accruing those hours, to see if perhaps there's a category or something that would make sense to be included based on, you know, so for example, the social work profession, they were having a situation where some individuals were struggling to pass their licensing examination. And so one item they decided to add in the regulation was to allow a limited number of hours for licensees that were coaching or mentoring people that were studying for the exam, as a way to spotlight that issue and as a way to encourage people to provide that mentorship type service. And, you know, as you're working through those items with them, there is part of a learning process with that. But also it's a way to help those individuals who are trying to become licensed and then reward those individuals who are providing that mentoring or coaching. So that was a sort of outside the box type approach. But if there's any items that you think would be helpful to be added to this, that could be something we could talk about next time too.
Terrific. That sounds like a good plan. Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. Okay, continued clinical license exam, the discussion.
Yeah, and we brought this up last time. There was a conversation about how our testing requirement compares to some of the other states. And part of this dealt with the topic of reciprocity. So perhaps individuals could become licensed in another state without taking the level of examination that Kansas requires, and then come in through reciprocity. And if this poses an issue, and if the advisory committee or ultimately the board would want to consider changing the examination requirements. And we showed a map last time that had the, I think one of the parts of this conversation, and that makes this a little challenging and a little tricky, is that the level of permanent licenses is not consistent state to state. There's a fair number of states that only require or only offer one level of license, and that's the clinical level. And they might offer a temporary license or a provisional license below that, but ultimately to become permanently licensed, there is one level. And so for some of those states that only require passage of one test, it may be partially due to the fact that they only have one level of license, where in Kansas, we have two different levels of permanent license. And we did show that map I talked about that showed what states require the NCE, which ones require the NCMHC, which one requires both, and which ones require an option of the two. And so at the last meeting, what I had offered to do was to try to do some research and collect information about what states have permanent licenses at what levels. I did do some of that research. I actually found a really good document that listed every state, and it had the requirements for licensure, what types of licenses are being offered, the tests that are being offered, and it's from 2010. So it's a bit outdated, and I don't think that would be helpful for us to work through today, but I have reached out to the ACA to see if they have a more updated version of that document. And so I'll be working with them, but this may be an item that we could revisit once we have that information in front of us, because I do think it's part of this discussion. I think at least the types of permanent licenses are just very different state to state, and that may be helpful for us to really view, because there are some states that do offer the level of licensure we do and the clinical level. I believe Illinois and Idaho, at least from that past version that I saw. But there likely are more, but I just want to collect more information. So I need a little bit more time to bring that back to you. So maybe we can continue this in more detail at the next meeting in August.
So is the ACA providing that updated list for you? Did they already have it, or are they going to prepare it?
The old document that I found that had all of that was back in 2010. That was a document by the ACA. And so I've reached out to their office, and I haven't heard back yet, but I just reached out to them at the end of last week to see if they had a more updated version of that. So so I'm just kind of wanting to see if they have something, or if it's more of an interactive. I saw some things on their site where you could look state to state in kind of a virtual type tool, but following up a little bit more on that from me. So
NBCC may be able to help as well. NBCC, the National Board Certified Counselor.
NBCC. So
Yes.
I did reach out to NBCC first, and I asked if they had a document like that, and they said they don't, but they said it would be a good item to work on. And so I continued to do a little bit of research, and that's how I came across the older version of that document, just from the ACA directly. So, but NBCC said that it would be valuable to have that information available. So it may be something that they work on, but it wasn't something that they had already in the works. So. Now, I forgot about that. It's been a little while since I reached out to them about that. So, but thank you for bringing that up.
Hey, like I asked a question last time, I'm still wondering, how is the counseling compact going to affect reciprocity?
So Laura and I were looking at that. Basically, the language in the compact, I believe, requires passage of an examination as part of the requirements for licensure. It does not name the specific exam that has to be passed. And so I don't think there, if it required the clinical level exam to be passed, I think you'd have a lot of states that wouldn't be able to have their licensees practice in the compact. So, because some of the states only require passage of the NCE. So I think it is still a requirement to have passed an examination, but the specific one is not named in the compact language.
We have written to the one of the analysts at the compact, who's working on the compact, for a list of those national tests. We just reached out last week, so as soon as we have that, we'll include that.
Yeah,
I
because
don't think they haven't decided. I think they're inclining to go to the NCE, but they haven't decided.
okay. Yeah, because the language in the compact says passage of a national examination as approved by the compact commission or something like that. And so we were curious if there had been a list that were reviewed and already approved by them. So
Yeah, where are they?
No, they're still working on it. I don't think it will be long before they decide. But that, at the moment, they don't have any decision about what they're inclined and they're moving toward NCE, but that has not been decided.
okay.
Yeah, when I spoke with somebody at this is Council for State Governments. They had mentioned they weren't sure if they would designate a test because things could change. And so if there were changes to the test that might be used, the effect that could have if they were constantly having to update what test it was. So I know they were still unsure of if they were going to name something, if they weren't. So generally what I know is that the NCE and the NCMHCE are the two tests generally recognized for counseling, and they base this off of existing state standards. So right now, I don't know that there's a state that accepts another test outside of those two. So that's kind of what I got when I was asking about that. The way that the compact affects this is we still have the thing. There's still, there is going to be that there's folks that join the compact, but that's a limited number of people that can join the compact. In terms of, one, they have to be independently licensed, and two, they have to pass all the different checks. Not everybody will opt in. And so the reason why we still need to have our stuff aligned is for individuals that do a single state licensure process for Kansas. We still need to have ways of addressing this for whoever those people are too. So the compact is not a catch-all. It's not once your state is in, now everybody that's at that level is part of it. People still have to apply and opt in to be part of this. So even independently licensed people may not choose to join the compact, which means we still have to have our own existing systems. So there's that part of it, that the state still has the responsibility of managing that part of it. So the compact does not take that over. And I will say again, it came up just last week, another person that expressed concern about the fact that they know people that, because they couldn't pass the NCMHCE in Kansas, went and got licensed in Missouri instead. Like, they were already licensed in Kansas, but they got their license in Missouri and then got fully licensed over there as well. And then they just applied for reciprocity in Kansas through our little loopholes. And so there are more folks in Kansas becoming aware of people that are bypassing this. So either we get rid of the exam if people are just going to, and then the issue is that there's always say, I'm in Kansas and I have to meet a higher standard than the people that I know that are going licensed in Missouri and then coming back over here and getting reciprocity and not having to meet that standard. They just get to skip the test altogether. So the issue is, how do we address that?
Does anyone know if historically something changed? Because I was licensed in Missouri first, came over, and I had to take the exam I had everything else done. I was fully licensed there for years, but I still had to take the exam. So the second exam for Kansas. So did something change? Like, did we historically do something like that different?
If you came in to Kansas and had to take the exam, then you didn't apply through reciprocity. You would have filed a standard application, because we don't have people to take the exam through reciprocity.
It was 10, 12 years ago. So it was a while back, but I did everything that I basically told at the time. But so now someone can just come, or maybe they just didn't have, I don't remember them saying that you could even have reciprocity exactly. But to me, I think you have to close the loophole, because if you don't close the loophole, I think a lot of people would have taken advantage of that. And we're going in lots of different directions. We have been for a little bit now. We've try to make it easier, I have concern with lowering the standard to remove the exam. I think it's an important exam. I think it is essential in the diagnosing piece of evaluating. And I think it goes kind of the opposite of what we were talking about earlier when there was consideration or concern. We're already reduced from 6 to 3 hours for ongoing diagnosing. Now we may not even, or now there's even exploration and would we even test for diagnostic skills?
Right.
And I'm not for removing the exam, but what I'm saying is, if we don't close the loophole, then what's the purpose of the exam, except for Kansas licensees?
Right. True.
Because I know that within our little regulation, it outlines that, if you meet the educational requirements, then I believe, Leslie, you can either get like a supervisor attestation, you had to practice for 3 years at that licensure level. And then there's a third one in there too, or you could pass the licensure exam, but you have to meet two of
Three.
of the requirements.
So the first one is taking the NCMHCE or clinical, 15 hours of clinical coursework, including psychopathology and ethics. So that's one or the other. And then an attestation from someone who's clinically licensed or 3 years of clinical practice.
So if you meet the educational requirement and then get a supervisor sign off, then you can skip the test. And I think that's where, when we talked last time, that's where the loophole is there are folks that are meeting the educational requirement, which doesn't necessarily mean they're competent. It just means they took the class that they were supposed to, but didn't necessarily maybe practice it all that much. And then they can get their supervisor, which we would hope would be honest and forthright and say, yes, but what supervisor is not gonna, there are going to be many that are going to say, okay, sure. And so then they get in, and so they just say, well, I can't pass my test. And not always great test takers. I get that too. So I recognize that there's a learning component and a test taking component, but either we got to close the loophole where people can't get around the test, or we just say the test isn't that important. I mean, I don't know. But I'd be for closing the loophole. So this now third conversation people have mentioned to me about concerns about people they know that are just not passing the test here or don't want to take the test here. And then they're saying, why am I having to be doing more when everybody else is just coming in? So
Those questions are only going to happen more often as the word gets out.
Awesome.
I thought it might be. Go ahead, Asha.
No, I was going to say that, for me, the beauty of the states and having different evaluation systems, I think it's a good thing. If somebody does go to Missouri and get a license there, our requirements still say that after you get your independent license, you have to do 2 years or so before you can do this reciprocity. So I still think if you practice at the independent level for 2-3 years, that is the price you pay for to get reciprocity. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Some of the students, my supervisor who was studying for the national mental health counselor's exam. She's like, wow, this exam is so good. I want everybody to take it. Anyone who was taking that exam always testifies to it. I remember I was in Ohio when I did my NCE. At that time, they used to combine both together, and it just a lot of people were failing the test, and they decided to split it and do it like we do now, have 2-tier tests going on. There are some people that are just good clinicians, but just not good with tests. So, I don't think we should prevent them from practicing just because they cannot take that test. I think maybe it depends on how we sell it. Those of us, Andrew, those of us who are in council education, there is a lot of benefit to taking that test. A lot of benefits. If you want to be a good clinician in Kansas or anywhere, taking that test is just a good thing to do. But the truth is, there are a lot of people who are just that test not their thing. So if somebody wants to exploit that, I don't know. It'd be nice to close the loophole, like I don't know whoever was talking earlier about taking coming from Missouri and taking the test here. I think it was a good experience, but I don't think everybody will have to do that. And some people are just not good at testing, they take a test. Just again, that's just my 2 cents to it. I don't think it's a bad thing. The loophole looks bad, but it may help some people who are good clinicians, just not good at test takers.
Well, and I appreciate the comments, and I did want to share this map again. We looked at this map last time, but it is interesting. So the color that is kind of the greenish blue is the states that only require passage of the NCE. Now, like I said before, not all states offer 2 distinct levels of permanent licensure. But I think one of the reasons we were probably hearing about this is because while that's kind of one of the smallest groups that only require the NCE, it does happen to be some of the bordering states of Kansas. And so, but there are.
They don't have 2 levels. They only have the LPC, which is their independent. the bordering state, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Missouri.
And there is a group that require passage of the NCMHC, and then there's a group of states, about 13 or so, that require passage of both exams. And then there's other states that require an option, either passage of the NCE or the NCMHC. So there's really not one specific model that we would be following. But I just kind of wanted to remind you kind of how differently this is spread across the United States based on levels of licensure and some other factors too. But so wanted to share this.
I wanted to add one thing just to make you aware. So most MFT has the same coursework or the exam. LMLP have the same thing, coursework or the EPPP at the independent level. Social work is different. Social work does not have the coursework allowance, so they have to have taken the exam, have an attestation by someone, or have 3 years of clinical practice. So if they didn't take the exam, which every state requires now for social work, they would have to practice 3 years. So that would be a way to kind of close the loophole, but still allow people in after they practice for 3 years. If you change the reciprocity to say they have to have 2 of the 3, but not allow coursework as an alternative to the NCMHCE.
Leslie, could you also, because I'm looking at it here.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the coursework requirement, I see the potential or the testing requirement. And then you have the attestation by the supervisor that shows you either had 3 years of clinical practice that included 8 hours of client contact per week during 9 months or more of each year, a mental health center and so forth. Or you have, it also includes another employment setting. There's an attestation by the applicant that the applicant engaged in a minimum of 3 years of independent clinical practice that included diagnosis, treatment, mental disorders, as well as supporting documentation in the form of published job description and so forth. But then there's the number 3 says, and this is the one I think most people take, is the attestation that the applicant has demonstrated competence in diagnosis that's signed by a professional licensed to practice medicine and surgery, or by a professional licensed psychologist, social worker, and so forth. That number 3 one seems like that's the one that most people would take advantage of, right? They would, because they can get the coursework, and then you said they have to meet 2 of the other 3.
No, if they have
Just
the
2 of
coursework,
3
they have to
things,
meet
right?
one of the other 2, either
Right.
3
So they
years
can
or an
have one of the 2.
attestation.
So then that's what most people take then, right? They say have the coursework, and then they have the attestation from someone. Doesn't even say it has to be a supervisor, it just has to be a person that's a professional that's licensed. They don't even have to have supervised the person.
No, it would be like someone you consult with if you're in a private practice or something like that. It could be.
So we don't even have, that person may not have any idea, really. This could be just being willing to say that they do. But it seems like that number 3, you could say, okay, we keep the coursework, but then you have to practice for 3 years at the independent level before you get reciprocity. If you take number 3 out, so you give the option of you can take the test or you can have the coursework, but if that number 3 is gone, then they still have to practice a certain amount of time before they can just get reciprocity. Would that be accurate?
If you make the coursework separate.
Well, if you, because it says the coursework, right now we allow either the coursework or you can take the exam. And then you have to meet one of the other requirements.
So but if you take away the attestation, that means someone who took the clinical exam would have to practice for 3 years before they could come in through reciprocity. So they would have to be higher. I mean, it would be increasing their requirements.
So that's why social work took out the coursework requirement or the coursework allowance.
Right.
I got it.
So is that what we want to do?
I will say, just because of all that's gone in this session, that I don't believe the statute says that you have to pass the NCMHCE to be licensed as an LCPC in Kansas, if you're just applying standard regular application. So it would require a statute change if you change reciprocity requirements. It would not, it may not require a statute change, opening your statutes and doing a bill if you were to determine that someone could pass either exam for the clinical license.
So an or instead of an and.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Oh, because social work only has one exam. Is that right?
They have a master's. And I guess there is a state, Michigan doesn't require them to pass the clinical exam.
Social work has a different exam for each license level. So they have a bachelor's, a master's, and a clinical level examination.
So then how did they have a statute change then to make that?
Several years ago, yes.
Okay.
I'm just
Okay.
telling you that because I don't know how motivated the board will be to open statutes in the near future.
Right. Well, and I don't know that adding NCE or NCMHCE addresses to have an EB either. And the question is, do we need to do anything, or is this just a matter? I mean, I've had a handful of people say this seems ridiculous that we're held to a higher standard than people that are coming from other states. Is that enough motivation for us to have to make changes or not? If you add NCE, that's not going to address that issue of people saying, I'm having to do more to be licensed here because I live here than people that are coming in. But is that just the way it is? I don't know. But
I think it's the way it is. I usually, when students say that to me, I say, hey, your license is it's a very recognizable for some of the big states like California, Florida, New York. Those states, when you bring your license from Kansas, you get a reciprocity without a problem. Somebody from Missouri may have difficulties having a reciprocity in those states. So I usually say, hey, you're getting a very good license. It's going to transfer pretty much anyway. So in that way, I don't think we need to change anything. That's just my take. Because it is a good license. I think it is transferable pretty much everywhere.
So I know we're running a little bit short on time here, but I do want to mention something that I think is important as part of this conversation. So, sometimes when other states change their requirements and lower them, people can say, oh, it's a race to the bottom, because if one state lowers to try to attract more people and then other states have to match it, you do have to wonder about the public protection part of it. And I know some people anecdotally say, oh, well, they changed their requirements, so now everybody's going to go over and practice in another state and not practice here in Kansas. For the professional counseling profession, our numbers are definitely not decreasing. And over the last 7-8 years, your profession has about doubled in size. Back in July of 2015, there were about 1,148 licensees, and now you have about 2,148. So it's not a situation to where we are losing. I mean, I know some people retire and some people on a case-by-case basis might leave, but your profession is one of the fastest growing ones comparatively for the other professions. And so I do think there's probably a good way for us to maintain good standards. And if people say, oh, well, everybody's leaving or we don't have licensees in this area, the numbers definitely don't reflect that. So I just want to make that clear when we have this conversation too.
Thank you. So it sounds like our decisions are, do we leave it alone or do we continue to figure out how to close the loophole? Should we take a vote on that?
On whether to continue conversation or Leave it, is that right? Sorry, I just want to understand.
Leave it as is or take a vote. Do we leave it as is? If we say that, then we leave it as is. If we don't, if we agree to not leave it as is, then this would be an ongoing conversation. Anyone?
I move that we leave it as is.
So you're making a motion that we vote to leave the statute as it is, correct?
That's my vote.
So you're making a motion that we can vote on?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and I would need a second for that. Okay, I see Jim Kilmartin seconding. I saw this. So the vote is, are we agreeing to leave this as it is? All in favor of leaving it the way it is, say aye. I don't hear people. So all in favor of leaving it as is, say aye, please. Do we have any ayes? There's an aye. Anyone else? Okay, those who are opposed, say aye.
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 Aye, aye. Okay, so it sounds like we're not leaving it as it is, and we're going to have an ongoing conversation about how to fix this. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so so it is an ongoing conversation and we will figure out how to solve this at future meetings. That's what we voted on. Okay.
I just wanted to offer a thought. If we're concerned about competency, quality, then we could just require not require the NCE, but require the other, just that one. So then that would eliminate the loophole situation, which seems to be a concern.
It wouldn't for reciprocity.
Not only that, many states have tried that, taking just that somebody who is just coming out of graduate after 2 years or 3 years of graduate school. Many who hasn't had any experience practicing and finds it very difficult to pass that test, or hire try for many years and then they have to drop it and make it to 2-tier test. So that's one of the arguments.
Okay, well, we need to keep bringing that into consideration as we figure out how to solve this problem. So that will be our ongoing work. So David, you and I can meet very soon about this, and anybody else that wants to weigh in, we'll do it at our meeting, okay? Our next meeting. Okay, next, let's see, discussion of unprofessional conduct regulations. We're out of time. So David, can we move that to our August meeting?
Yes, and I know you just received that packet just a little bit before this meeting. So between now and the next meeting, please review that packet. It includes recommended changes to unprofessional conduct for each of the professions. And I think you'll find that interesting as you look to see what other changes other advisory committees had recommended. And just be thinking about, do any of those make sense to bring forward as additional changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations for your profession? And then we can bring those up at the next meeting.
Great, terrific. Okay, we have homework. Okay, next meeting, August 7th, 10 a.m. And I need a motion for adjournment.
I motion to adjourn.
Need a second?
I second it.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I will ask for opposed. Don't think I'm getting any. Anybody opposed? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for all your thoughtful discussion and hard work today, and we will see you in 2 months.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
You.
Thank you.